Hi, everyone. Well, we have been learning so many amazing things about God through the stories that we've been talking about from the Bible. And today we are going to talk about another story from the Bible that just shows how amazing and how powerful God really is. So today's story takes place before Jesus came to earth. And so it takes place in the Old Testament. That's where we find it. And it happened to a man named Jonah. Now, Jonah was a prophet of God, but he didn't act like prophets normally act. Now, Jonah, he was from Israel, and his father's name was Amittai. And Israel at that time, they had a lot of enemies, and one of their enemies were the Assyrians. Now, the Assyrians, they had attacked Israel over and over and over again, and they had treated Israel very badly. In fact, they were known for being very, very cruel. So Israel, and probably Jonah himself, they didn't like people from Assyria very much. So one day, when the word of the Lord came to Jonah, and God said, Jonah, I want you to go to Nineveh, and I want you to preach against that people, because the wickedness that they've been doing, it's come up before me. Well, that was the last thing Jonah wanted to do. You see, Nineveh was the capital city of Assyria. So Jonah didn't want to go there. And for that matter, probably people from Assyria wouldn't be too happy to have someone from Israel come to their capital city either. Jonah didn't want to go down there and tell the people that they were so bad, that they were so wicked, that everything they were doing was so wrong, that the God of Israel, who made heaven and earth, was angry with them and he was going to punish them. What if they didn't believe Jonah? What if they captured him and threw him into jail? Or even something worse? Or what if they did believe Jonah? And what if they repented and then God didn't punish them for all the wicked things they'd done? Well, there was no way that Jonah had any desire to go to Nineveh. And so Jonah made a very strange decision. He decided to run away from God. So instead of going to Nineveh, which was around here, Jonah decided to go down to the Mediterranean Sea to a port near here called Joppa, and he decided to get on a boat that was heading for Tarshish. Well, Nineveh's here in the east, and he's going in the total opposite direction, all the way west. Well, Jonah, he paid his fare, and he got on board ship, and he went below deck, and Jonah went to sleep. And in fact, he fell into a very, very deep sleep. While he was sleeping, something happened. You see, Jonah thought he could run away from God, but can you really run away from God? I mean, God is everywhere and God knows everything. So no, you can't run away from God. So God knew exactly where Jonah was, and God sent a big wind to the Mediterranean Sea, and a storm grew, and it got very, very violent, and the waves crashed, and the storm was just beating against that ship so much that the ship was in danger of breaking to pieces, and still Jonah slept. Well, those ships weren't just small ships. These ships that traveled to Tarshish, they were big commercial merchant ships, and they would carry cargo to sell to the different places. And so they were built for the Mediterranean Sea, because the Mediterranean Sea had storms come up. So they built these boats to be strong, these ships to be strong and withstand these storms. And yet this storm was so violent that the ship was in danger of being broken to pieces. And in fact, the sailors who had sailed the Mediterranean probably many, many times, they knew this was different and they were afraid. And each one of those sailors, they bowed down and they were praying to their God. They were crying out to their gods. But nothing happened. The storm just got worse and worse and worse. Do you know why? Well, they were praying to their gods, but they weren't praying to the true God. They weren't praying to Jonah's God, to the God of the Bible, who made the heaven and the earth and everything in it. And so when they prayed to their gods, nothing happened because their gods weren't real gods. They couldn't do anything. They can't hear or see or touch or do anything. So the storm got worse and worse and worse. And so they got afraid and they decided to start throwing the cargo that the things that they were going to sell and make money with, they threw it overboard to make the ship lighter. And so they started throwing everything overboard. They started throwing everything they were going to sell overboard because they were so afraid. But you know what? It didn't help. And the captain, he went down below deck and he found Jonah asleep, and he woke him up and he said, "What are you doing asleep?" He said, "Get up and pray to your God, and maybe your God will relent and save us." Well, the sailors, they were convinced that someone on board had done something to warrant this storm, to cause this storm. And so they did something called casting lots to find out who it was. And God caused the lot to fall on, guess who? Jonah. So they said to Jonah, "Jonah, who are you? You who have caused this big storm. What have you done? Where are you from? Who are your people? What country do you come from?" And Jonah said, "I'm a Hebrew, and I worship the God of heaven, the God who created land and sea, and I'm running away from him." And the sailors, they were afraid, and they said, "What have you done?" And so the storm, it got worse and raged on and on. And so finally they turned to Jonah and they said, What do we have to do to you to make the sea calm down?" And Jonah said, "The only thing you can do is to throw me overboard into the sea, and then it will calm down, because I know that this storm is my fault." Well, the sailors, they didn't want to do that. I mean, if they threw Jonah into the sea, he would drown for sure. And so they tried to think of something else. So they tried rowing to shore. So this wasn't just a small little rowboat. This was a huge ship that had these long, long oars, probably about 30 on each side. And they were very, very long. And so they rowed with all their might and strength. And they tried to row out of the storm, but they couldn't. There was nothing they could do. And finally, they realized that all they could do was throw Jonah overboard. So they prayed to Jonah's God, and they said, "Please, please do not blame us for this man's death, because you've done what you wanted." And so they took Jonah and they threw him overboard. And as soon as they did, guess what? The sea calmed down. The storm was gone. And so those sailors, they were greatly afraid of the God of Jonah. And so they sacrificed to him, and they made vows to him. In the meantime, Jonah, he's in the middle of the Mediterranean, in the middle of the deep, by himself. And the currents are around him, and the waves are crashing over his head. It was terrible. And even the Bible says that seaweed wrapped around his head. Poor Jonah. Let's see if we can get the seaweed on his head. Seaweed wrapped around his head. And then he started to sink down underneath the sea to the bottom of the Mediterranean. And then Jonah remembered. And he prayed to God, and he asked God to save him. He was going to drown. And you know what God did? God sent a great fish. Okay, this is the biggest fish I have, actually. So it was a lot bigger than this fish. And it was a lot bigger than Jonah. Sometimes people say that it was a whale, but the Bible doesn't say it was a whale. The Bible says it was a great fish. And this great fish came swimming along and swallowed Jonah. And the Bible tells us that Jonah was in the belly of this fish for 3 days, nice suns, and 3 nights. And then Jonah prayed to God, and he asked God to save him. And God did. God told that fish to go and throw Jonah up onto dry land. And it did. And so Jonah was on dry land again, and God gave him the command again. God said to him, "Go to the city of Nineveh and tell them what I have told you to tell them." And this time Jonah obeyed. Now the city of Nineveh, it was a very, very great city. In fact, the Bible tells us that to go through the city of Nineveh would take 3 days. That's how long it would take to walk through it. That's how big it was. And so on day 1, Jonah entered the city, and he called out and he said, "In 40 days, you guys are all going to be destroyed by God because of your wickedness." Well, surprisingly, the people of Nineveh believed God. And they were afraid and they were like, what? And so they said, we declare they're going to fast. And fasting means they are not going to eat anything. And they all of them, rich or poor, they all changed their clothes. They took off their nice clothes and they put on sackcloth. And sackcloth is like very plain, very uncomfortable clothing. And it showed that they were sorry for what they had done. And they repented. They were really sorry. And then even the king, he heard what God had said, and he got up off of his royal throne. And the Bible tells us he took off his royal robes and he put on sackcloth and he sat down in the dust. And that was to show that he was really sorry for their wickedness too, and that he was showing that God was like so much more powerful than he was, and that's why he was sitting in the dust. And then he issued a decree. And his decree said, everyone, every person, every animal is not to taste anything. No one's to eat or no one's to drink. Everyone's to wear sackcloth. And everyone must urgently pray to the God of Jonah, to the God of the Hebrews, and ask him to forgive us. And everyone has to stop doing their wickedness. They have to stop doing the bad things they're doing. You must stop. And maybe the God of Jonah will have compassion on us. And maybe he'll change his mind and he won't destroy us in our city. Well, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think that God is going to still destroy Nineveh? Or do you think that God is going to decide to forgive them and let them live? Well, if you want to find out, you're going to have to join us next time. I'm really glad you were here with us today, and I hope we will see you next time. Bye for now.